Our first speaker is Professor Shawn Astor from Bar-Ilan University. Shawn and I have known each other since I didn't have gray hair and he was just a graduate student doing first year Hittite together, if I remember correctly. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Professor Astor as not a little boy learning Hittite, but as a professor of Bible and Ancient Near East at Bar-Ilan University, and he's going to talk about indigenous Jewish identity, definitions, and threats.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Horowitz. I want to begin by echoing some of what Dr. Trotter said and thanking very heartily and in a heartfelt way all of the indigenous friends of Israel around the world, especially to thank those of you who are coming to Israel, who are making the effort to be here, who are supporting us through the last 2 years of hell. We are grateful to each and every one of you, and we very much value your support. And so thank you very much to all the indigenous friends of Israel, to all the friends of Israel in general. We really, really appreciate your support, and you should know that we mean it. Even if you get to the airport and the clerk fills in the wrong form, or if you go to a bus and the bus driver drives away without picking you up, that doesn't mean that we don't like you. We appreciate it. Thank you. And this is particularly meaningful in light of the mobilization of indigenous discourse by anti-Israel forces around the world. I think that the last 3 weeks have made things last month have made things quite clear that we are not dealing with a global movement whose sole concern is the welfare of the people of Gaza. Were that the case, then the global movement that we saw over the last couple of years would have mobilized against the gangland executions of Gazans in Gaza by Hamas in the last few weeks. We haven't seen that kind of mobilization. Instead, what we've seen, sadly, on university campuses around the world is a mobilization which uses the suffering of the Gazan people, which we acknowledge, to mobilize and force and speak out against the existence of Israel. We are not against anyone else's indigenous claims, but we assert our own indigenous claims. We are not, as the Prime Minister once said, we are not conquerors in the Congo. We are here to speak about the country from which we are exiled, to which we are returning. That is a very, very challenging point in world discourse. And what I aim to do in the next 20 minutes or so is to show how that was negotiated in the first exile of Jews from the land of Israel, or really the second exile, but part of the first period of exile of the Jews from the land of Israel, the Babylonian exile, which took place 586 BCE after a series of wars by the Babylonians against the kingdom of Judah. Approximately 586 BCE, the Temple of Jerusalem, as is well known, was destroyed. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed. The ruins can be seen today. And the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. And I'll speak a little bit about how the Babylonian Empire, which at the time was the major empire in the Near East, tried so hard to treat the Judahites, who later became the Jews, of course, as they treated everyone else in the world, which is exile you to Babylon and make you into new Babylonians, and how the Judahites reacted to that experience. This research project brings together the research of two people who are in this room a moment ago. One is Professor Wayne Horowitz, who is the leading expert in Israel on what's called the Al-Yahudu tablets, the tablets that were discovered in cuneiform inscriptions and left to us in Babylonia to be discovered by antiquities pirates many thousands of years later, and some of which are now in this museum, and by Risa Levitt-Cohen, who was here a moment ago, and I hope is still here, who is one of the world's leading experts on Ezekiel, Ezekiel will play a prominent part in this discussion. And so I'll begin by raising the question of what is indigeneity. And I'm sure that those of you who are in this room who have studied indigenous peoples know this question much better than I. But I'll briefly summarize that some of the key points in understanding what is indigeneity have been discussed by various UN panels. There is no universally accepted definition, but these are some of the characteristics of indigeneity: self-identification, the language, the culture, and the beliefs, the resolve to maintain and reproduce in ancestral environments. And you see here, expressed in much greater verbiage, the points that Dr. Trotter summarized a moment ago: land, language, people. And the idea of historical continuity with the pre-colonial society. And as you can see here, the first two elements are group togetherness. And the latter two elements that I summarized on the board are something more than that: the desire to reverse the process of exile and return to the ancestral land. And that division, where on the one hand there's group identity, on the other hand there is the desire to reverse the process of exile and return to the ancestral land, to what extent can we identify these specific elements in the two records we have of the Judahites' exile to Babylon? When I say the two records, I don't mean two specific documents. I mean, on the one hand, the cuneiform record, which is displayed in this museum, and on the other hand, the biblical record, which is preserved in Ezekiel and in many other texts. I'll demonstrate how Judahites in Babylonia not only preserved their identity, but also promoted their sense of being an indigenous people exiled from their land and preserving a connection to it. The second level argues not only for preserving a connection to the group, but also for preserving a connection to the land. Again, one of the three elements Dr. Trotter emphasized. I would like to emphasize a further point. The Babylonian exile took at least 60 years, so that many of the people who, after those 60 years, who saw themselves as Judahites in Babylonia, had never actually seen the land of Israel. Right? These are people who preserve an identity over at least two generations. We'll see, of course, it's much more than that. It's 3, 4, 5 generations. Who had never seen the land of Israel and yet preserve a connection to the land. And preservation of indigeneity, that preservation of connection to the land, is a second and higher level than preservation of identity. Of course, identity preservation has to come first, and then we can talk about preservation of indigeneity. So let's begin with some evidence from the cuneiform record, and let's talk a little bit about how a specific group of people in Babylonia could preserve a group identity over several generations without being on their ancestral land. The Babylonians' goal in exiling people from the land of Israel, and they exiled not only Judahites, they exiled Ashkelonites, Gazites, people from other civilizations. There are Edomians who were exiled. There are large groups who were exiled to Babylonia. And not the clear point that emerges from the cuneiform record is that when the Babylonians exiled these people, they wanted them to contribute to the economy of Babylonia. Many of these people were settled in the southern parts of Babylonia, which had been devastated in wars with Assyria, and the idea was settle there, improve the economy, make money, and we'll tax you. That was the goal of the Babylonian Empire. Let's try and get as much money as we can out of this land, and let's bring more people into it. Regarding the merchants among the Judahites could integrate fully into Babylonian merchant society. And we have some sense of what happens at Sippar, which is one of the cities in southern Babylonia, sort of central, a little bit north of the south part of Babylonia. And Yigal Bloch, who's a curator at this museum, has shown that Judahites could in some cases, did integrate into the merchants there. So they could become wealthy, they could take Babylonian names, and they didn't have to stay Judahites. And we have this evidence clearly illustrated in the cuneiform record. In contrast, the rural community tended to give Judahite names. And this is one of the ways in which we can identify Judahites in the cuneiform record, because it's a way of preserving identity. But there's another important practice that I'll talk about now, and that's the practice of grouping together Judahites. The Babylonian ideal was to settle the Judahites in the countryside, let them farm and develop the land, just like every other group developed the land, let them stay in the countryside, and let them group themselves as ethnic groups, and then pay taxes to Babylonia. In other words, the taxes weren't imposed on each individual, but on the group of people who settled in a particular place and were told to work the land, develop their abilities, develop the agriculture, and then the Babylonians would tax them as a group. And so there was a group of Judahites settled in a particular rural place, and those Judahites were supposed to, as a group, pay taxes, and as a group govern themselves, not make trouble for the Babylonian Empire, and address their own needs. Now, this grouping together appears in reference to what are called the Shushanu farmers. We have in texts from the Yehuda archives, from the Nashar archives, and these Shushanu farmers are nearly fully slaves, nor they're fully free men. They're obligated to work certain tracts of land and to remit taxes to certain officials in return for service. The Shushanu, who are identifiable by Judahite names, were grouped under the service of certain officials, and they're not randomly distributed across the land, but they're grouped in specific areas. In other words, I'm just summarizing from the cuneiform record what I illustrated earlier. And there's a group togetherness among the Judahite rural population, which certainly contributes to preservation of identity. And you can show the same picture from the Murashu archives, where we see group togetherness formed using a technique called the Chatru groups. Again, the Judahites stick together, they're under clans or groupings that are called Chatru, and there's more than 60 different Chatru societies in the archives from Murashu, which are a little bit later in the period of Babylonian exile. But the Judahites are not randomly distributed across the 60 societies. The Judahites are grouped in 3 of them. So again, see different ways, either in grouping them as farmers with the same responsibility, same organizer among the farmers for the Judahites, or the Judahites being among Chatru societies. The Judahites stick together. So they're farmers, they're soldiers in the Persian army, they held their lands as a kind of fee for service, but the key point for our purposes is they stick together and were not randomly distributed across the different societies, whether there be the societies of farmers or the society of Chatru. So far, I've just shown what is widely known in scholarship, that Judahites in the rural sector in Babylonia stuck together. And that certainly promoted preservation of identity. But if you remember what I spoke about at the beginning, I said I don't want to just talk about preservation of identity, I also want to talk about preservation of indigeneity. And to what extent do we find resolve to maintain and to reproduce ancestral environments? So let's look at several points of evidence that show that they wanted to reproduce and to maintain a connection to the land from which they were exiled, which is something that is unique in the cuneiform record. First of all, there is the tendency, there is an interesting phenomenon we find in the documents that I illustrated, that I talked about earlier, the cuneiform documents, that the Judahites all grouped themselves under the official of the government who was also responsible for the land of Israel. In other words, Judahites are sitting in Babylonia, but they, for reasons which are not entirely clear, at least not clear to me, pay their taxes through the governor of the Persian province, which is also responsible for the land of Israel. They maintain their allegiance or their connection to that Persian province, which is called in Latin Transpotamia, or in Akkadian Eber Nari, the land across the river. And it's not clear why the Judahites did this, but Yuval Levavi, who's one of our promising up-and-coming Assyriologists, suggests that there's some kind of attempt at maintaining a connection to the land of Israel by paying and grouping themselves under the governor, who's also responsible for the land of Israel. Where else do we find indigeneity? Another piece of indigeneity is illustrated by in a publication of Wayne Horowitz, which is published by a journal that comes out of this museum, where it shows the rent. It's a fascinating contract, and I think we have to give credit to Wayne for recognizing it. Judahites in Babylonia rent fish nets, right? Not fishnet stockings, actual nets to catch fish. And they do this in the month of Elul, which is the 6th month of the Torah calendar. And then they return them after the beginning of the 7th month. The 7th month is the month of Tishrei. And if you know the Jewish calendar, you know that the beginning of Tishrei is the Jewish New Year. And so why are they paying such a high premium for the renting of these nets? And Wayne and David Geva argued that they're observing in Babylonia the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the holiday of the Jewish New Year, and they're doing this by paying a premium on the fish nets to catch fish for the holiday. If we share this piece of evidence with fishmongers in the Israeli markets, they would certainly use it as a way of marketing and jacking up prices on fish before Rosh Hashanah. Don't tell them. This is the point for our purposes is that there is an observance of the Jewish calendar in Babylonia, and I think that that's really, really important and interesting. It's one piece of the preservation of identity. The second piece that I want to talk about is this fascinating name list, which was published by Wayne, by Philip, by Yoshua Greenberg several years ago, and it's now it's studied again by Wayne and Jan Safford, who's sitting upstairs, and it's been published by Pierce. It dates to 517 BCE, and look at the names. I want to talk about just three of the names. Three of the names here are Yashuv Tzedek, name number 5 on the right. Number 3 on the right, excuse me. Yashuv Tzedek, may the justice return, right? Or may the victory return. Yashuv Dili, may the one who's mine return. And the last one, Ya'aliyah, which clearly means may God bring us up, right? And to bring up, as Yigal Bloch has illustrated, to bring up means to leave Babylonia and go up the river and come back to Israel. So there is a tendency among Jews in Babylonia to keep the calendar, not only to keep the calendar, but to give their kids names that express the idea of return. So I want to highlight the point that these people have been in Babylonia for some time. These are names of people which were given to people born not earlier than 538 BCE. And after 60 years of Babylonian exile, they give their kids names that talk about return. That's really, really significant and really important. And it illustrates the idea of return as a prominent element in the Babylonian exiles' Jewish community. Okay, I don't want to I don't think we can really underestimate the significance of this document and the names it contains. It coupled with the other slightly more boring evidence I summarized earlier about grouping together and grouping themselves under the governor of the province that includes the land of Israel, and the fish contract. All this points to preservation not only of identity, but of indigeneity. There's an attempt to maintain a connection to the land of Israel throughout the Babylonian exile. So how and why did they do this? How and why did Judahites in Babylonia preserve identity? I think that there is a very clear guilty party here. And with the time that remains, and please tell me how much of it that I have. Okay. With the time that remains, I'd like to address that guilty party, who is Ezekiel. Because I think that while there is certainly it's impossible to think about Ezekiel as having done these things on his own, Ezekiel is the galvanizing force, at least in the documents we have, Ezekiel is the galvanizing force behind this idea of preserving Judahite identity in Babylonia during the Babylonian exile. Now, I'm aware that there is a large body of biblical scholarship led by Zimmerli, which argues that the book of Ezekiel is much later, but it's not. As Risa Levitt-Cohen has shown, based on the work of Moshe Greenberg and many other scholars, Ezekiel is composed in Babylonia. Anyone who knows the cuneiform record and looks at the book of Ezekiel and looks at the language knows that the book of Ezekiel preserves elements of cuneiform language and the type of thinking that you find in Babylonia. There's a nice article by Jean-Philippe Delorme, a Canadian scholar, who illustrates this. It's not really an arguable point anymore, with all due respect to Zimmerli. Ezekiel, throughout the first 24 chapters, engages in a large-scale project of indigeneity preservation. And I think that language, that term has to be applied to what Ezekiel is doing. Because Ezekiel, in cooperation with the Judahite elders, is trying to preserve not only an identity of the Judahites in Babylonia, but an indigeneity of the Judahites in Babylonia. Sort of one of the classic and easy examples of this is Ezekiel chapter 4. In that chapter, Ezekiel is told to recreate the siege of Jerusalem on a kind of brick, to draw the siege of Jerusalem on a brick, to lie on his side watching the brick. Now that's bizarre, right? Why is he doing this? It's a sign to the house of Israel. What's the point of this? The point of it is, in the absence of a television screen, which shows what's going on in the land of Israel, thousands of miles away, where he's been exiled to Babylonia, and the city of Jerusalem is being destroyed. He's being told, okay, the city of Jerusalem is now being destroyed. Pay attention to it and watch it. It's like watching the television broadcast of the destruction of Jerusalem. He can't take his eyes away from it because he has to recognize what's going on in the land of Israel, a land from which he's been exiled several years earlier. To quote, "And to the siege of Jerusalem direct your face, and your arm will be naked, and prophesy to it." And Ezekiel is then told to eat bread of affliction. Right? The bread is very disgusting. He's told to eat this disgusting bread and to experience the eating of dung-based foods. And he says to God, wait a second, why should I eat dung-based food? I'm not dung-baked food. I've always preserved my ritual purity. And God says to him, you can take it a little bit less impure, but you still got to continue to eat this. You have to experience in exile what the people in the ancestral homeland are experiencing. And to demonstrate this to the rest of the exilic community, don't hide in a room and do this. Show everyone else in the exilic community what you're actually doing. This is a very powerful scene, a scene so powerful that the important Jewish philosopher Maimonides says it couldn't have happened in real life. But nevertheless, the point of the scene is for the prophet to identify as a member of the pre-exilic land, to tell all the other exiles, you're connected to that pre-exilic land. If he can't be in Jerusalem, he has to connect to Jerusalem by his eyes, by his taste buds, by his sense of touch, a sense of smell. And the community has to watch, has to smell, has to hear the experience, and to recognize that their point of reference is the pre-exilic land. This is a really powerful point which Ezekiel does, and which conveys the sense of connection, connects it to the land, and it ties into what we see in the cuneiform records. And that's why I really feel strongly that we have to look at Ezekiel as a historical piece of that period of Babylonian exile and indigeneity preservation in the Babylonian exile, with all due respect to biblical scholars who want to take Ezekiel out of that context. Ezekiel does not deny the justice of the exile. He emphasizes that the exile is justified, but he insists that connection has to be maintained. And we see this further in, as I talked about Ezekiel 4. There's this idea of the scattering of the hair in Ezekiel 5, which speaks about the punishments of the land of Israel. But he recognized that there's going to be destruction, but he also emphasizes that there needs to be a connection to the land. And we see this in the landscape elements that appear repeatedly. In Ezekiel 6, he speaks about the mountains and the hills and the streams and the valleys. Right? Mountains and hills and streams and valleys is something that anyone who's driven the roads of the land of Israel experiences. The roads go up and down as you try to get into Jerusalem, you know. And of course in Babylonia, it's a big plain. And so he emphasizes throughout the book of Ezekiel the landscape of the land of Israel. And then we get to Ezekiel 20, which is in some ways the most powerful piece of evidence here, where Ezekiel puts himself into conflict with the exiles. Because the exiles say to Ezekiel, okay, very nice, you're talking to us about how we're connected to the land of Israel, but bottom line, we're here in Babylonia. We can't get out of Babylonia because there's a Babylonian decree, which Yigal Bloch, again, from this museum has published, which says anyone who leaves Babylonia and is given refuge by someone who helps them leave Babylonia the house of the person who gives them refuge is going to be destroyed. He's going to be killed. And there's no possible help for anyone who leaves Babylonia. There's an enormous threat of the Babylonian Empire against helping people leave Babylonia. The Babylonian Empire doesn't want the Judahites in Babylonia to be starving. It wants them to be wealthy so they can tax them. But it doesn't want them to leave. And so there's no way out. And so Jews go to Ezekiel in chapter 20 and they say, okay, we're coming to ask you what our future is. They're coming to do the word darash. Tell us what our future is. And the clear goal of the inquiry is to find out about the future. And Ezekiel says, you think I can tell you about your future? And he gives them a very, very long discourse in Ezekiel 20 about their past. Right? As if you read Ezekiel 20, I'm not going to do it now, but you can do it on your own. It gives them a description of what happened in the past. The last three words on the screen. Et toavot avotam hodium. Tell them the abominations of their ancestors. Tell them all the bad stuff their ancestors did. And of course, as he does that, he tells them each time, God forgave you, God forgave you, God forgave you. And then he tells you, so that's their past. So what's your future? Your future is your past. And that's the key point that Ezekiel's trying to get across. Connection to the pre-imperial, pre-colonial society. You will, right, he tells them in verse 32, here's the nice survey of your past, but if you think, if you think you're going to become Babylonians, hayol lo tiyeh, it's not going to happen. You think you're going to integrate into Babylonian society and accept the idolatry of Babylonian society as normal? It's not going to happen. God says in verse 33, I'm going to take you out, verse 33 and verse 34, in language redolent of the Exodus from Egypt, I'm going to take you out of Babylonia. I'm going to force you out of Babylonia. I'm going to bring you back to the land of Israel. Wait a second, what does that have to do with our past? They come to him to ask about the future. They're told about the past, and then that the ultimate future is a return to the past. The return to the pre-exilic society. And this explains in large measure, this program of Ezekiel explains in large measure how and why the Israelites, or the Judahites in Babylonia, are forced into a identity in which there is a preservation of indigeneity, resolving to maintain and to reproduce the ancestral environment and to maintain the Judahites as a distinctive people with a connection to the land from which they were exiled. So did Ezekiel promote indigeneity and the Judahites follow? Did Ezekiel follow the Judahites' desire to group themselves in groupings that were connected to the governor of the land of Israel, as we see in the cuneiform documents? Did Ezekiel encourage the Judahites to go and pay high prices for nets of fish to celebrate the Jewish New Year? We're never going to know the answers to these questions, at least until the fish merchants get their hand on this tablet. But what we will know, the historical picture is very clear. The conditions under which the Babylonians treated exiles supported maintaining group identity, but did not encourage return. At some point, the exiles decided to maintain their sense of identity, despite the hopelessness of returning to Judah. And that sense of indigeneity was promoted either by the historical figure Ezekiel, who said something very similar to the prophecies we have in his name, or by other unknown figures who did other things to promote indigeneity. Right? This is the sort of problem of who wrote Shakespeare. It was either written by Shakespeare or by someone else called Shakespeare who lived in the time of Shakespeare. So the promotion of indigeneity was either done by Ezekiel or by someone else who lived in the time of Ezekiel, who did the kind of stuff that Ezekiel is said in the book of Ezekiel to have done. I'll leave it to you to figure that out. But that sense of indigeneity can hardly have been restricted to the bits of evidence that I've illustrated here from the cuneiform record, which I hope to find more of, and I'm sure my colleagues who are better versed than I in the cuneiform record will be promoting this. But that sense of indigeneity can hardly have been restricted to this bit of evidence. There must have been much more widespread among the rural Judahite community, and that sense of indigeneity provides the fertile ground for what happens after less than 70 years of exile, or 70 years of exile, depending on your count. After 70 years or so, 538, declaration of Cyrus, the beginning of the Judahite return to the land of Israel, a very, very slow and difficult process. illustrated in the prophecies of Isaiah 40 and following, which ultimately leads to the much later, in the time of Ezra, almost 80 years later, the final the building in a substantial way of the city of Jerusalem, the founding in an established way of the province of Yehud, the return of a certain number of exiles, their integration with the Judahites who didn't leave the land, and then we get from 100 years after Ezra, we begin the process of moving from the Persian period to the Hellenistic period and continue the trajectory of Jewish history in the land of Israel. I think that story of return, although it ultimately ends in exile, is enormously significant because the first return paves the way for the second return, which we're living through today, with all its trials and tribulations and horrors. And when I think about the possibility of further exile, which is something that has not been absent from our thoughts in the last 2 years, we recognize that despite that horror, there will always be another return. It's the preservation of indigeneity that allows indigenous peoples to keep their identity, to keep their connection to the land. I think in this respect we share a bond of resolve with indigenous peoples around the world. We encourage you to speak with us, to engage with us, to share with us your points of agreement, disagreement, and we are grateful for your support and for your and for dialogue with you. Thank you.